Hey makeup friends, welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, then hello and welcome. My name is Kara, and today we're going to be ranking 10 of my neutral eyeshadow palettes. So I want to address what I am meaning by the term neutral, because I know that certain colors can still be considered neutral, even though they are an actual color other than brown, but for today's purposes, we're just looking at essentially all brown palettes. I have decided to exclude the Tartelette in Bloom palette from this ranking, if only because I have talked about this palette every month this year, and if you're not bored of it, that's impressive because I am. So I thought I would give us all a break from busting this one out again for today's video, but we do have 10 other palettes that we're going to look at, so I think we are very well established here. Now, these are all full-size palettes. I didn't include any mini palettes, if only just to keep it a little bit more manageable for myself. I do plan to do some swatching. We're going to switch to the overhead view so you can really get a look at these palettes. And I'm going to be ranking them in a way that I have never ranked anything on my channel, and that is I've looked at certain categories. So I have set up 5 different categories to assign a score to. So I've got versatility. So within an all brown palette, is there versatility there? Some of them are going to shine, some of them are not. We will get to them. I've also got a category for blendability, for opacity, and with that I'm thinking more in specific with the matte shadows, because there is another category for shimmers. And what I mean by shimmers, I was having a hard time just picking the word that I meant for it, but the impact of the shimmers and how metallic and foiled they are, but also taking into consideration how well they last on the eyes, how easy they are to apply. So it's a very broad category, but I will do my best to sort of explain why I'm giving the score that I'm giving. And then finally, I have a category for packaging. And I thought doing it that way and assigning a score out of 10 within each of those categories might lead to a somewhat more objective ranking than me just looking at them and deciding which one is my favorite, because I became very stuck very quickly trying to do that. So I haven't gone through them. I haven't pre-assigned any values. We're going to do it together with the overhead camera, as I said, and we'll see where it lies out. If I was to make predictions right now, I can't predict all 10, but I'll predict top and bottom. So bottom, I think, is going to be the Mary Jane palette from Melt Cosmetics. Top, I don't have them all open in front of me, so this is a little bit tricky. I think there might be a two-way tie between the Ethereal Eyes from Makeup by Mario and the ABH Sultry palette. Those are my predictions. Those are going to be the top 2. This is going to be the bottom, and because I did top 2, let's do bottom 2. I think the Glam Face palette from Natasha Denona is going to be in the bottom as well, but we shall find out. Now, as I've gone through the categories, you'll notice I didn't include a category for cost, and that's because cost is easy for anybody to determine. Cost is just the price per unit. Value is the harder thing to establish, and value is going to be very dependent on every person. Okay. I have rambled on long enough. We're going to switch the view and we're going to get right into it. All right, so here are the 10 palettes that we're going to be looking at. So I'll just open them up briefly. We are going to go through them in more in depth, but just so you get an overview, we've got the Mary Jane palette from Melt Cosmetics. Then we have the Sultry palette from ABH, and this is one that I did hem and haw over whether I would include it. This coral shade in particular was really kind of throwing me, so I hemmed and hawed, and I think what I'm going to do is just sort of try mentally to exclude that one shade, because the rest of it, if you take that one out of there, it really does fit the theme. So I figured for the sake of one shadow, we can let it slide and we'll include it in for today. Next up, we have the Natasha Denona Glam palette. We also have the Natasha Denona Glam Face palette, and this was in the light shade. So this one comes with a cream blush and a highlighter. I'm not going to be taking those into consideration, just these ones down here. Although now that I think about it, I did say I wasn't going to include 5 pans or less, but for the sake of having 10 palettes, just a nice round number, I think we'll just keep it in. And I'll share my thoughts on these two with you anyways. Why do we do that? Because if you're looking for a neutral palette that has a little bit more with it, I'll just share my thoughts on it when we get to this one. Then we have the Ethereal Eyes from Makeup by Mario. This is the newest palette that I have purchased. You can see that I've gotten quite a bit of use out of it already, particularly this shade, but we will talk more about that momentarily. And we've got the Patrick Ta Extreme Dimension, is that what it's called? Major Dimension eyeshadow palette. This is the first one that he released. And there's 2 cream shadows under here. Got the Artist Couture Supreme Nudes palette. BH Cosmetics Sugar Cone palette, part of their Sweet Shop collection. This is what I'm wearing on my eyes today. Then we have Going Coconuts from Colourpop. And then finally we have this palette here from Christina Sicalius. This is the, oh please forgive me, Luce Del Sole, I believe is how you pronounce it. And there are the shades in, oh sorry, that's cleavage shot, unintentional, there we go. Alright, so we're going to do these in absolutely no discernible order whatsoever. The only reason I'm starting with Sugar Cone is because it's what I'm wearing today, so it's fresh in my mind. So as you can see, there's a nice row of shimmers and a row of mattes. So I've been looking at the categories that I've set out for myself. One of them is versatility. So in looking at this palette, do I see a number of eye looks sort of coming into mind? Now certainly I think technique comes into it, because even with a limited number of shades, the way in which you apply them, you can use the same shades and create different types of shapes and looks, but really I'm looking at the color story in and of itself. I don't want to get too technical in terms of technique. So in looking at the mattes here, particularly these two, there's really not a lot of differentiation. In fact, this entire middle quadrant is a little redundant in my mind. There are some differences between these two and then the 2 mattes, but they're not as obvious as I would like them to be. I'd like to see a little bit more of a gradient and maybe have this one be a little bit deeper. In the viewfinder, it's looking quite dark, but in real life, it's really not. So I'm just going to go ahead and do some swatching, and I can see that I have not made a lot of use of this palette. Part of that is because I've been doing the project pan, but also it comes down to storage and just how many palettes I have. I mean, I'm ranking 10 neutral palettes. That's just 10 brown palettes. I don't need 10 brown palettes, but here we are. So I can't promise I'm going to swatch every single shade in every single palette, but this one only has 8, so it's really not that time consuming to do. So, I mean, you can see that there are tonal differences between those 2 middle shades, but in terms of their depth, they're pretty much hitting along the same note. So building a gradient is a little bit challenging with this palette because of that. But I will say at least the sort of undertone of these shades is complementary one to the next. You don't have a very cool toned shade mixed with a very warm toned brown. They do work together, which is nice. It's just there's not a lot of room for establishing a gradient. And if we look at the shimmers here, I think they've given a nice selection of shimmers, and you can see just how pretty they are. But again, those 2 in the middle are not very different one from the next. Certainly I'm not saying that they are the same, because they're not. I think there's a little bit more difference between these 2 than there is between these 2. I just, again, when you only have 4 shimmers and 4 mattes, if they could just space them out in terms of their depth and whatnot, that would be a little bit appreciated. That would be very appreciated. So now comes the tricky part for me, and that is providing a score. So I have the 5 categories. So versatility, that's mainly what I've been talking about here. So for versatility, I can't really fault it too harshly. I mean, at least there are light and dark tones and then some mid-range ones as well. I just can't give it a very great score. So I'm going to give it a solid 5 because I think there's definitely room for improvement, but at the same time, it's not horrible to work with by any stretch. So I'm going to score versatility as 5. And then the blendability of these shades is definitely there. So in particular, these dark shades or this dark matte, I had no issues in applying that today. These shadows do build up really nicely, one on top of the other. Yeah, I haven't really been frustrated with any of the matte shadows in here. I don't think they are the most blendable of the shadows that I've worked with, so I don't want to come out and give them a straight 10 because I don't think they quite deserve that. But I would say a solid 8 for these mattes for both blendability and opacity. And then the shimmer shadows here are honestly very easy to work with. You can pick them up with a regular flat shader brush. You don't need to just use a finger. This one in particular is highly, highly reflective. It's beautiful as an inner corner highlight or on the lid. These ones in here are a little bit more on that satin side as well as this deeper one. But even having said that, they do catch the light and reflect nicely. They're just not as high impact as the lightest shade. They do last really nicely on the lids. They don't flake off. There's no glitter in them. I don't have to use like a tacky base underneath them to get them to stay. So I am going to score them an 8 as well. And then we look at the packaging. So this is cardboard packaging. It does have a mirror in it. You'll see some staining on there. The names are printed underneath the shades, which is quite nice. It does fold all the way back. Some people don't care about that. I like it just because then it's easier just for holding and application purposes. I very rarely use the mirror on any palette. It's not like high end, but there's no cracking along the spine. There's nothing really to complain about. The lid stays nicely and securely closed. So it's cute, right? Like it's not high-end, fancy luxe packaging, but it's also not a fancy high-end luxe brand or price point. So I'm going to score the packaging as a 7 out of 10. All right, we're going to jump straight into the next palette. I'm not going to tally up the scores as we go. I'll do that at the end because I don't want any sort of subliminal influence on me. So we're just going to go straight into the Patrick Ta Major Dimensions palette. So again, you can see the row of mattes versus the row of shimmers. And then there are these cream shadows here. I do like that it has that little case here. So let's start with packaging first because I think this one has very intelligent packaging. It will lose a mark because it shows every little fingerprint, which is kind of annoying, and also for filming purposes, reflective palettes are a pain in the ass. I'm not going to dock it for that, but the fingerprints are a little annoying. But overall, like it's nice, sturdy packaging. Again, it's got that nice, satisfying click to it, so you know that it's secure. I think that this is absolutely genius. If you're going to include cream shadows, definitely include something that's going to help to protect them. Huge mirror. I do like that if you wanted to use the mirror, like you can angle it whichever way you want and it stays there. It doesn't fold all the way back for holding purposes, but I guess that's the trade-off that you get, is that if you want to use the mirror, this is very functional. So I'm going to go and score this as a 9 out of 10 for packaging. So then let's take a look at the shades themselves. I do think that this is a very versatile palette because you have that full, well-established range here. And then with the shimmery shadows, you also have a mix of finishes. This one looks matte in the viewfinder, but it has like tiny, tiny, tiny micro glitters in it. Just creates like the illusion of light on the eye without being a full-on opaque or full-on shimmer shadow. This one has it as well, but it's very, very subtle. So when you're using that as like a transition shade or an inner corner highlight, it's not over the top. So I actually quite like the inclusion of those. The cream shadows, I've had this palette for at least a year and they have not dried out at all. I actually quite like them as a base for the other shadows. They are very, very blendable. They're easy to work with, and they just help to boost up the intensity. So if you put that really deep one underneath, you're going to get a much smokier, more dramatic eye. This one, if you buff it all out, again, the blendability is there, but you buff it all out, you can get away with just wearing that as an eyeshadow. I do that every now and then, or I'll just buff that all over the lid and then just pick up a little bit of one of the shimmers, just kind of tap it over the center, and there is, if it'll catch the light for me, it's really shiny from my angle, there. And that just makes for a super easy eye look. That's like one of my weekend go-to kind of looks. So in terms of versatility, I think that this palette is definitely there. You've got quite a few different options to choose from and different ways of pairing them. The opacity of these shades, I mean, you saw the creams, how they apply. Let's just do a few of these matte shadows so you can see them there on the fingers. They're very, very smooth, very soft, very easy to work with. I actually really, really enjoy this palette. Again, if we just blend it out a bit, you can see just how easy that is to blend. The shimmer shadows, again, you can just pick them up straight with a brush, which I really appreciate. I don't like when I'm forced to use my fingers because you lose precision that way, because shades like this I really do like to use as an inner corner highlight, and I don't want to be going in with my fingers trying to do that. There's the shimmers here. I haven't had any issues with them creasing or falling down all over my cheeks. And again, you can see that they just apply really, really nicely and some very good intensity to them. These two down here have a little bit less sparkle to them than these two. So I prefer this kind of finish, although I will say with shades that are deep like this, I do like them to be a little bit more toned down because it just makes for an overall more dramatic sort of eye look. But I'm going to rank these shadows on a whole for versatility, blendability, and opacity as a 9 across the board. And then for the shimmers, I'm going to give them an 8. Next up, let's talk about the Supreme Nudes from Artist Couture. This one's been around for a while as well. And I have tried swatching some of his other palettes that have come out, and I just have not enjoyed them as much as this one. There's something about this palette that just sucks me in. I think it's because it looks like sweater weather in a palette, honestly. Something about this more like mustardy kind of tone just speaks to my soul. So in terms of versatility with this one, it's a little bit harder to gauge because the shimmers are kind of interspersed, so it's not quite as linear as my brain likes it, but you do have quite the range of shades in here. You've got a really nice deep dark shade, a really nice light cream shade, so between the two of them you can lighten and darken any of the other ones. For only having 4 shimmers in it, they've given you a range of colors to choose from. So you've got a really deep bronzy one, a more almost like an olive tone, and then the more champagne-y, bronzy, coppery kind of shades here. So this is one that I do think has quite a bit of versatility in it. And then in terms of how these shades actually apply, they're certainly not as soft and smooth as the Patrick Ta ones, but I've never had any issues in terms of their opacity or not being easy to apply. There you can just see those. Just buff that deepest one out a little bit so you can see the blendability there. So they do blend without becoming patchy, and it blends for days. And then the shimmers in here are not quite as like punchy as I normally like, but I forgive this one here called Supreme because it's just so damn pretty. And it just like bury me in olive green, please. Just, oh, such a gorgeous tone. And then this one here, so there they are. I mean, these two definitely catch my eye. This one is color specific. And then I think a lot of the palettes that have this like really deep bronzy kind of tone in it, most of them are not super shimmery. I don't know if it's just something with that tone or whatnot, but like I said, with the Patrick Ta, I actually kind of prefer these really deep ones to be less on the blingy side. It just makes for a dramatic eye look. So there we have those. Again, these last all day. They're beautiful. Pick them up with a brush. They apply like a dream. So now we need to rank these guys. So in terms of versatility, I am going to give it a 9. I think it's got a good mix of mattes and shimmers, although I think there's room for maybe taking out one of the mattes, maybe this one here, and putting in another shimmer just to round it out a little bit more. But I do think there is quite a bit of variety in there, so I'm going to give it a 9. The blendability of these shadows, they do build up really nicely. They do blend out really nicely. They layer on top of each other. It's a really nice palette to work with. So again, I'm going to give it a 9. Opacity, going to give it a 9. I've never come across a dud in this palette. And then the shimmers, I'm going to give them an 8. Oh, okay, and then packaging. So we need to talk about that. So again, nice hard plastic packaging here. Obviously you can see what the name of it is. It does have a little bit of like, almost a little bit of a downslope on the edges. It's not really domed, but it's not really flat either. More so on the bottom. It's a little bit more obvious if you can see it there. See how it's got that angle right there? And then in terms of the closure, you can see the magnets on there. It does hold quite nicely. It's got a very large mirror if you're into that kind of thing. Again, the shades are written underneath the shadows. I like that there's no wasted space. Very nicely laid out in here. But I do find that for storage purposes, this is a little bit of a pain to store just because of that beveling edges. So I'm going to dock a mark from that, and we're going to call it a, you know what, we're going to call it an 8 out of 10, because there's really nothing all that exciting going on with it either. I do like the functionality of it. It's not exciting to look at. So we'll give it an 8. Oh, I'm going to look like I've been digging in the garden after this. I'm trying to keep them clean, but it's a little hard when all we're doing is touching brown eyeshadow. All right, Sultry from ABH. This is one of those like limited palettes that they bring back every once in a while. They brought it back last year after not having it for about 2 years. Why they wouldn't make it part of the permanent line, I don't know. But at any rate, here we are. Keeping in mind, we're ignoring this coral shade. So, okay. So, I mean, covering that up really does sort of change the whole palette, if you ask me. So looking at this, I think the shimmers are what add the versatility to this palette, because there's such a wide variety of tones that are in here. In terms of the matte, I have a hard time honestly working with like the cream shades and the black. You can use them to deepen and lighten anything. The black from ABH is a great formula if you do like a black shadow. It's just, I find that blacks are a little bit harsh in terms of even deepening up shades. I prefer a deep, deep brown, like Dystopian. I get more use out of a deep brown personally than I do out of a black shade. So I don't tend to use that one all that much. I do find that Birch is a slightly strange undertone. It's kind of in line with Twig, but not quite. Like it's got almost like a mustardy kind of something to, I'm not a huge fan of this shade. I don't use it very often, so it kind of leaves me with these mattes in here. So not super, super versatile for the matte sake, but the shimmers really do add into it. And some of these shimmers are gorgeous. Like Cyborg is beautiful. It's not quite a silver, not quite a taupe, but somehow it's just this gorgeous blend of the two of them. And I think that makes it just that much more quote unquote wearable. It's not a true silver, so it's not like that harsh, cool toned, in your face kind of look. I mean, to each their own. I actually don't mind wearing like a true silver shadow, but this is just a little bit softer, a little bit more approachable. It almost tends to lean almost like there's a purple undertone to it. I think it's a very user-friendly shade, and I think it's absolutely stunning. Some of these other shades in here as well, like Pearl and Rose Quartz, they're also very beautiful, These are not glittery kind of shadows. They don't fall down onto your cheeks. Again, you can pick them up with a brush very easily. Can you tell that I lose my mind when I can't pick up shimmer shadows on a brush? It just bothers me to no end when I have to use my fingers because they just kind of like crumble underneath. But the shimmers in this palette are just beautiful. The mattes, again, I tend to gravitate towards Twig and Dystopian, but I will swatch out Slate just for the sake of showing you. So again, it is more on like the cooler toned side. And we're not talking about that coral shade, I know, but it does help to warm the palette up a little bit. Regardless, there are just a smattering of the shadows for you. So then, looking at the versatility of the palette, I'm going to give it a 7. I know that this is very subjective, so, you know, catch me on a different day, I might assign different numbers, but this is just what we're doing today. Again, I have not sort of gone through these in advance to sort of predetermine what I'm going to assign, so we're going to give it, what did I say, a 7 for versatility. I just have to find it on my list. For blendability, these shadows are beautiful. Like the mattes are just, they're a dream to work with. Noir is as intense of a black as you could hope for, and yet it does, like it applies beautifully. There's no patchiness in there whatsoever. And it will blend for days. Okay, so for blendability, I'm going to give it a 9.5. I'm going to allow myself to do half marks. I'm just trying to find it. Blendability, 9.5. Opacity, 9. Shimmers are beautiful. I'm going to give them a 9.5. I don't know if I'll assign a 10 to any of these. I don't know. We'll see. And then packaging. So there's pros and cons here. So I like that I can fold it back and hold it in my hand. I wish ABH would stop, just stop giving these brushes with these palettes. I, for one, just throw them out. They're a double-ended brush. I don't like storing double-ended brushes. It's always the same shape regardless of the palette. They just must have a warehouse full of these damn brushes that they just shove in here, but it just creates wasted space. It's not necessary. I do like that she moved away from the suede packaging, and I mean, it's glitter. I can't knock glitter. I will say this one, like, it doesn't rub off on my fingers. There are some little signs of wear along the edges, but I have had this palette for a very long time. There is a mirror, but again, if you are reliant on it, you're going to have to find a way to hold it up. But it is very pretty packaging. I very much like this, so I'm going to give it an 8. I think there's definitely some room for improvement on it, but it's a step in the right direction for ABH. All right, let's talk about the Natasha Denona Glam Face palette. So this is the only one that's going to include some cheek products as well. We're going to talk about them really quickly. The highlighter, I like. I think it's really pretty. I think it's really flattering. It's a very soft kind of formula. Reminds me of like the Benefit Cookie highlighter kind of formula or my beloved Jouer highlighter. So I actually really enjoy this one. I am just not a fan of Natasha Denona's cream blushes. I've had some of her blush palettes in the past. I just don't like them. They kind of feel puttyish. Like they're not super creamy, so they're a little bit harder to pick up and apply. I do find that it kind of blends into not much. I don't want to say it blends into nothing, but I find I have to keep layering it up, and it doesn't really last all that well throughout the day, so I'm just not. But then we move on to the shadows. So granted, there's only 5 in this one, so it's already at a little bit of a disadvantage to the other ones that have significantly more. But when you're only including 5 eyeshadows, that's where I think particular attention has to be paid to the versatility of the shades that you include. And for me, crease and smoke are just too similar. They're showing up in the viewfinder as though smoke is significantly deeper, but I can assure you it is not. And I will assure you by swatching rather than sitting here and fighting with my camera. Let's do that. So those are the 3 matte shadows that we're working with. So that is called Transition, which arguably I think is quite deep for a transition, and I'm not the palest person out there, but this is deep on me. And then there's the other 2 matte shadows. So again, there is a difference between them, but it's not as dramatic as it could be. I think having this a little bit lighter, this a little bit deeper, leave this unchanged, and that would just flesh it out a little bit better, in my opinion. The 2 shimmers in here are beautiful. I mean, Natasha can certainly do a shimmer shadow, that's for sure. I find it strange that she names them inner corner, outer corner, blah, blah, blah. I guess it's maybe to help people who are newer to makeup, but put them wherever you want. Do whatever you want with them. I would wear this shade that's called inner corner. I would wear it all over my lid. The shimmers are above reproach. They are absolutely beautiful, so easy to work with. They last all day. They don't crease up. They don't flake away. They don't end up bunched up into like one little line across your eyelid. They are beautiful. And I do like that this one is significantly deeper once applied than the other. So that helps, because there's only 2 of them, it helps that they're significantly different from each other. So let's get into some ranking on here. Versatility is going to take a bit of a hit, not just because there's only 5 shades, but because the 3 mattes that they've included in here are really not all that different from each other. So I'm going to give the versatility a 5, frankly. It could have been higher. It really could have. I'm not docking it because there's only 5. But it just, for all the reasons that I said, I'm going to give it a score of 5 out of 10. If I can find it on my list. Goddamn. Glam Face. Okay. Versatility. 5. Blendability. Very blendable. These shades, the opacity and the blendability, I have 0 issues with, really. They're not as soft of a shade as, again, the Patrick Ta ones. They're not bad. They're nicer to work with than the ABH. Granted, my ABH palette is very old, so that could be why they feel dry. Maybe they just are dry. But I'll give these a solid 9 for blendability and opacity. For, will I? Yeah. I'm quite generous with my scoring, I understand. But for the shimmers, I said I wasn't sure I was going to grant a 10 anywhere. I'm giving these guys a 10. They're beautiful. They're so beautiful. So Glam Face gets a 10. Packaging, again, it's that kind of packaging that shows all the fingerprints. It is the hard shell packaging. Unlike a lot of her palettes, you can't pop the shades out. There is a large mirror. Again, you can adjust it as you want if you're using it. And I do like that, again, there is that plastic cover to keep the powders from going into the cream. So functionality is there, but I am going to dock a little mark off the white plastic. It gets very, very dirty. Looks a little bit cheap. I don't like to use that word, but like it looks a little chintzy, and I don't like the fingerprints on here, but I'm going to give it an 8.5. So we just talked about the Glam Face palette, so let's talk about the Glam palette. And this is arguably one of my favorite palettes from Natasha Denona. It's just right up my alley. Honestly, it's just right up my alley. So in terms of versatility here, we've got a 15 pan palette with only 5 mattes. So I do find that that's a little bit constraining. However, having said that, the mattes that are in here, we do have a nice like gradient here, even if, this is what I find funny, honestly. I'm gonna harp on the naming of these shadows one more time. Like, she's gone to the extent of like brow bone and center eyelid, but like put the 5 mattes in one row then and put them lightest to darkest. That would help people out. Anyways, minor gripe. Maybe that'll come in when we talk about packaging, but there is a good selection of mattes in here. So I think I would have liked to have seen just a few more mattes. So I'm going to take some points away for versatility for that. if only just to flesh it out and balance it out a little bit more. Again, 15, and there's only 5 that are mattes. The shimmers, there is some overlap. There's no direct dupes one from the next, but like these 3 are basically just the same shade on a spectrum. So again, there could have been a little bit more versatility brought in there, or just a more curated palette. I know this is like the size that she normally goes for is 15, but having said that, those are my thoughts on the versatility. Like these 2 are fairly similar as well. So let's do a little bit of comparison. So, I mean, in the viewfinder, they look almost identical. In person, they're not. This one has more of like a pinky undertone to it, and this one is more of like a champagne kind of color. So they do swatch differently, although on the fingers they look fairly similar. This one reminds me of Cyborg, or whatever it was called, from Sultry, but not nearly as impactful. And these shimmers aren't as impactful as the ones in the Glam Face palette either, so they are not going to rank quite as high as they did in the other palette. And then I'm going to just quickly swatch some of these matte shadows as well, just so you can see them in action. It's going to be the longest video ever. And that's okay. That's what we're here for. So there's just a selection. So there we go. There we go. This one needs to build up a little bit. Okay. So ranking of these, what are the scores we're going to give? So we've got versatility, I'm going to give it a 7. Blendability, I'm going to give it a 9. But opacity, I'm going to give it an 8. As we saw with this really deep one, I had to build it up just even in the finger swatch, so there is a little bit of a struggle with the opacity in the really dark shade, and even with this dark brown one, it didn't swatch all that great. Brush application is different than finger, granted, and they do build up, so that is very good, but initial opacity, I feel comfortable assigning it an 8. The shimmers, I'm also going to give an 8. I mean, they're pretty, but they're not worthy of a 10. So I'm going to give them an 8 on that. And then packaging. So again, hard plastic. What's nice about this is it's got a bit of a rubberized back, so it doesn't like slide across the table very easily. All these little holes, or we can pop out and move around the eyeshadows if you want, or create a custom palette if you want. So that's very helpful rather than having to try to dig these shadows out. Large mirror that is, again, wherever you want to set it to. Shade names such as they are listed underneath. No wasted space. And the gold is certainly a nicer look. Well, like, it's not really gold, but like the creamy kind of, whatever the hell color this is nicer than the white. I don't know, the white just, I don't know, bothers me. So it's very plain. There's really nothing exciting going on here, so I'm going to give it like an 8 out of 10. It's very functional, very practical, but not particularly exciting or pretty. Right, on to the Ethereal Eyes palette from Makeup by Mario. So this is one that I got to replace my Tartelette in Bloom palette. They're similar. They're not exact dupes. I did talk about this in my most recent video and did some side-by-side comparison swatches, so if you're curious about the differences or similarities between this and Tartelette in Bloom, I will try to do my best to remember to link that up in the eye bar so that you can find that. So this one, I think arguably this is quite a versatile palette. Now, the pink is kind of cheating a little bit, I get it, but it's not nearly as like so far out of the neutral envelope as the coral shade in Sultry was, so we'll let it slide. We'll let it slide for today's purposes. So again, I do like that you have a nice light shade up here. I can use this to set my oh gosh, eyeshadow primer. Lost the words there. You've got some good transition shade options, so a more on the warmer side, this one on the cooler side. These ones we're going to swatch and compare because they do look quite similar, and then you have this really deep brown, so that's obviously the deepest shade in the palette. All right, so there are some of those shades there. These are very soft shadows to work with as well. Definitely a palette that you want to tap the excess off. As you can see, there's little bits flying around. It's really not obnoxious to work with, but definitely tap the excess off or it will transfer onto your cheeks a bit. But you can see just how smoothly they apply. And while I said that these two look fairly similar in the pan, you can see that they do swatch differently and they have different undertones. So again, I think that helps to add into that whole versatility. I need to come up with a different word. I need a thesaurus. Versatility. What's another word for versatility? I don't know. Anyways, there's that. Again, the shimmers, you've got a nice mix of shimmers in here, more gold kind of toned, almost like a chocolatey brown. Can't really call it bronze, but it's a really deep color. Again, not super reflective, but that's been the theme with all of these palettes. This shade, you can tell already how much I love it. Like, look at the dip in it already. I've had this palette for like a month and a half. It's beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. And again, these shadows are so easy to work with, and I don't need any sort of special base underneath them to get them to show up, adhere, and last all day. They are beautiful. This one's more like a satin kind of finish. Why am I doing this all out of order? That's silly. Anyways, there you can see them. You can see just how reflective a lot of them are. This one's almost more like a topper kind of shade, which in the past I haven't been huge on toppers. I am starting to change my tune a little bit. The more I'm wearing neutrals, the more value I see in toppers because it just helps to transform those matte shadows underneath them. But these shimmers are beautiful. This one in particular, I just love it so much. So, okay, let's rank this bad boy. So, the versatility of this palette, I think it's pretty high, to be honest. Maybe could have gone a little bit deeper with this one. I will say that it does build up quite nicely and you can get a nice deep dark shadow out of it, but it's obviously never going to be deeper than what you see in the pan. So for the versatility on this one, I'm going to score it a 9. The blendability of these shadows, this palette is honestly really nice to work with. Like, it's really nice to work with. It's been a welcome addition to my collection. I've gotten a ton of use out of it, and I predict that I'm going to get continued use out of it. So for blendability and opacity, I'm going to score it both a 9. Blendability, I'm going to give it a 9.5. Opacity, I'll give it a 9. Shimmers, I'm going to give it a 9.5. I got to dock half a mark just because this one is just kind of, meh. I mean, my earlier sentiments about these dark brown, sort of satiny kind of tones stand. I think they really do add to a look, but my heart will forever be with these kind of shimmers here. So I'm going to give it a 9 for the shimmers. And then the packaging, you can see on the inside, there's no shade names printed. For the most part, like as an everyday consumer, I don't care about that. Like, I could not care less what the shades are called, genuinely. For YouTube purposes, it can be helpful if I'm doing some sort of eye look, which I have not done in a while on camera, but to pinpoint specific shadows, it's helpful if they're printed in here. Yeah, they're on the back. Well, even at that, the shade names are like EE6, EE10, like it's not really all that helpful. So, regardless, it's a very, very minor gripe. Excuse me, the mirror takes up the whole packaging side there. Again, you can put it wherever you want. It does, excuse me, close very securely, stays closed. But as you can see, with white packaging, it does pick up every little mark and it gets very dirty very quickly. So I am going to dock a mark because of just how easily stainable it is, but I do like that there's nothing wasted, there's no extraneous packaging, it's not bulky in any way, so I'm gonna give it an 8 on the packaging. Okay, Mary Jane from Melt Cosmetics. So there we go, mix of mattes and shimmers. And you can see it's very deep and dark. And so if I'm looking at versatility of this palette, I feel that I'm very constrained with it because it's going to be a dark, dramatic look. Like there's little wiggle room in here for making things a little bit lighter. So I don't get a lot of use out of this palette, if I'm being perfectly honest, because I just find that it goes from 0 to 60 a little bit too quickly for my liking. So let's go ahead and regardless and just do some swatches. There's only 4 mattes in here, so I may as well swatch all 4. Get the deepest shade, and then we go from there. This one is not showing up very well. A really heavy swatch to build that one up. Yeah. So those are the mattes that you get in the palette. So it's, like I said, tricky to work with because these 3 are all, they could be the deepest shade in the palette. Either, like any of them, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Like if these ones didn't exist and this was the deepest shade, it would still be deep. Like they're not middle of the pack kind of deal. This one, I'm struggling to get it to show up. I mean, it is now, but you saw how much I had to put on to do that. So it's just, it's a difficult palette to work with in that sense. Because it's just, yeah, the versatility is just not there. So this is certainly not a palette that I could say is a must-have by any stretch. Again, all the looks tend to end up looking very similar because tonally or like depth-wise, there's really not much difference going on between these 3 mattes here. Now the shimmer shadows in here are a little bit hit or miss, to be honest. So I know I have to really build up that swatch there. So, oh yeah, and that's the problem with melt shimmers, is that sometimes they can be very fragile as well. But let's put these 4 to the test. So again, this is more like a satin kind of finish here, but you can see just how dark it is. And then this one here is like a really, really deep, I don't know, how do you describe that tone? Like a really, really deep bronze. And then this one here. Now I've done heavy finger swatches, so they are quite crumbly, but my experience with melt shimmers is that they are rather finicky to begin with. And then we've got this one here. So what I can say with these is that, like these, if you can see, yeah, these 4 shimmery shadows here, pick up with a brush and apply fairly easily. There can be, like, I mean, you can see how much has sort of fallen onto the desk here. You got to be careful because it will fall onto your cheeks. These ones here are so frustrating to work with. They are, that's on the outer side of each side of the palette. They're just not opaque. Like this one here, and I can't even really say that it's a topper because it's not, like, this one just kind of fades into the background and it doesn't really add anything. It's just not a great palette. If I'm being perfectly honest, it's just not a great palette. Sorry to say it, Melt, but it's not. Melt is hit or miss in my opinion to begin with. Anyways, some of their palettes are fantastic, others just not worth the purchase. This one is a purchase regret, sincerely. So, having said that, I'm going to assign some values here. So, versatility of this palette, I would say it is a 4 at best. The blendability of these shadows, well, why don't I pick up a little bit more just to make it fair? They do blend, but you can see, like, it doesn't blend in the way that, say, the ABH, that black, I managed to blend half of my arm with it. It doesn't blend in the same way. So I'll give the blendability on these a 7, because they're not horrific to work with, but they're not great. So I'll give it a 7. Opacity, I have to try to ignore the shimmers because they have their own category, but like this, there's only 4 mattes, and this one is virtually invisible unless you apply a ton of it. So I have to give the opacity, I'm gonna give it a 6.5 because these ones help it, but 25% of the mattes are a dud. So 6.5. Shimmers, don't like these shimmers. I just don't like them. Like this looks basically matte. It's not even really a satiny kind of shade. This one, I can see how much is just sort of like flaked up on top. I don't know if you can see. Physics. See that on my baby finger? That's just from wiping up from the swatch that I've already smoothed out. Oh gosh, I feel really harsh with this. I'm gonna give them a 4. Is that awful? I'm sorry. You know what? It's how I feel. I'm gonna give them a 4. And then look at the packaging. So that's just from doing finger swatches. So it does close with a nice snap, so I like that. I like how nice and thin it is. It does have a mirror, but again, it's one of those ones that you're gonna have to prop it up if you want to use it. For my purposes, I can bend it all the way backwards, so I like that. And you've got the lettering on the front, and it has like little, like, not quite glitter, but like little rhinestones or something in between. But you might be able to see from this angle that it's raised up. I don't know if you can see that, but the lettering is raised up, so if you wanted to stack palettes, that's going to impact on it. And I actually find the lettering kind of hard to read, to be honest. Like this, especially the Y. I find the R and the Y a little bit difficult. So I like the smoke motif in the back. I like that it carries all the way through. I think it's very appropriate for the color story, for the theming and all of that. I think there's a lot of wasted space. They could have done something a little bit different with the font. And I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't hate it. I don't love it. I'm going to give it a 7. So that leaves us with 2 palettes, my least expensive and my most expensive neutral palettes. Let's talk about Colourpop Going Coconuts first. So there we have it. It's just one of their very typical standard 9-pan palettes. I haven't used this one a ton, but I know I have worn it a few times. So my sort of review of it's going to be a little bit limited, so I will acknowledge that right out of the gate. In terms of the shadows here, we've got 5 mattes. This is a matte with a little bit of micro glitter in it, and then you've got the 3 shimmers in the middle. You do have a nice range between the light cream to the really deep brown, and then some filler in between. This one leans a little bit pink, which I think helps again with that versatility, insert alternate word. Let's just see here for a moment. What is a synonym of versatile?
Here are some synonyms for versatile: adaptable, flexible, all around, multifaceted, multi-talented.
Well, adaptable and multi-talented certainly don't work, but maybe flexible? That doesn't seem to... versatile, that's the best word I can come up with. Sorry, I'm failing. Anyways, let's take a look at the shadows. So let's take a look at this versus this one. We'll swatch the really deep one as well, and then we'll talk about the shimmers. So I'm gonna have to wash my entire desk after this. All right. So there's just a few of the matte shades. You know what, I'm gonna go ahead and do this one that has the little bits of micro glitter in it as well. Actually, they do show up quite nicely on this one. I don't know if you can, the camera will pick it up. Yeah, you should be able to see. It does catch the light there, so it is quite nice in that sense. It's very similar in tone to these ones, but there we have it. There's a very stark, almost white shimmer. And more of like a pinky tone and then like a taupey kind of color. I think I would have preferred if this almost white shade was more like a champagne shade. I think it would just go with the browns and not be quite as harsh. Like it would go with the browns a little bit more easily. You can see this one's not particularly reflective. Again, that deep bronzier kind of tone. None of them in these palettes have been shimmery. This one, I just think it's an odd choice, to be honest. But this one I have no complaints about. It's very pretty. So 1 out of 3. So in terms of versatility, let's not turn that into a drinking game because I think somebody would die, so let's not do that. But I think there's a few different ways that you can go with this. So even though there's only 9 shadows, the fact that this one leans a little bit pink, as does that inner shimmer here, the middle shimmer, I think that can spin you into a more overall pinkish kind of look. You can go really dark and dramatic with these shades over here. You can do like your standard neutral matte look, or punch it up with this guy with just a little bit of glitter, but not entirely like a foiled shadow. So I do think that there is some good versatility in here, despite having a very limited selection of actual colors. So I'm going to give it an 8. In terms of opacity, as you can see, I mean, this is the darkest shadow here. On a relatively heavy finger swatch, I wouldn't say that it's particularly opaque. You can build it up, but that's not, I'm not looking for build up ability. I'm looking for initial, straight out of the pan opacity. And so I have to kind of take that into consideration. These ones are doing just fine, but that is the deepest shade. I would expect it to have a little bit more oomph to it, and it doesn't. So I'm going to give it an 8. It's not bad by any stretch, but there's room for improvement. And that was the opacity. The blendability, you know what, I'm going to give blendability an 8 as well. These are, again, not bad at all to work with, but not the most blendable shades that I've ever encountered. You know what, actually, I think I'm going to give it a 7. I'm going to, because it's not blending outside of that initial line, even though I've added more to my fingers. So I'm going to give it a 7 for blendability. Now, shimmers on here. I'm not overly impressed by them, to be honest, for the reasons I've already stated. This one kind of saves it a little bit, but I'm going to give them a 6.5 because they're just not anything special. And then packaging, I mean, there's not much to really say about it. Hard plastic. I like that it closes with a snap, so you know it's going to be secure. The shadow names are on the back. They are also printed in here. There is a mirror that you can pose wherever you want it to be. But there's really nothing overly exciting going on. I mean, I don't know how you make a neutral palette super exciting, but it's just sort of run-of-the-mill. It's very forgettable. There's nothing, I mean, even down to the color of it, there's really nothing all that exciting going on. I do like the gold imprinting there. It just makes it look just a little bit fancier. So I'm going to give it a 6.5. Like it's above average, but it's not anything to write home about.
Luce.
Luce.
Luce. Sole.
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 All right, so now we are on to the Luce Del Sole palette from Christina Sicalius. So we've got a row of shimmer shadows, my chest, and a row of mattes down here. I really like how it's laid out from lightest to deepest. I just think it's so very user-friendly. Let's go ahead and do some swatches. These shadows are so buttery smooth. They're so nice. They're not super flaky. They don't kick up a ton in the pan, but they're just really, really smooth and nice to work with. So there are 4 of them. I didn't swatch the lightest one because the cream ones don't tend to show up on my skin all that well. But there you can see the other 4. And then we've got the shimmery shadows here as well. So I'll go ahead and swatch some of them. Now my understanding, and I'm just going off memory here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Christina is a makeup artist, and that if I'm correct in that, and I think I am, if I'm correct in that, it makes sense that she chose to lay her palette out in this way, because I think it just, again, just the ease of use is there. Takes a lot of the thinking out of it. There's 4 of the shimmery shadows. Again, one of those really deep brown, more satin kind of tones. A beautiful gold. This is the more pink toned one, and then a light pink here, and just for the lulz, and I mean, we haven't been here long enough, let's make this video just that much longer. I'm going to swatch the last of the shimmer shadows here. And that's, I mean, I would call that gold as well, but not in the way that this is. It's like a little bit more intense than champagne, but not quite gold. We are looking at the versatility of this palette. I think the shimmers really add to the versatility here. Like, there are none that are even close to each other. And likewise, honestly, for the mattes, I mean, these two are a little bit similar, but even at that, you can still see the difference in the depth. And then this one obviously is nice and warm. This one's a little bit cooler toned. You can really manipulate the palette any way that you want to, and these shimmers are all so beautiful. Not a dud amongst them. Again, this one's not as like in your face intense as the others, but I've repeated myself on that enough. I'm not going to do it again. So for versatility's sake, I'm going to go ahead and give it a 9.5, which is, I think, the highest I've ranked any of them today. Blendability, I mean, these shadows are beautiful to work with. They really, really are. They are very, very blendable. I didn't even add any more. That's just been sitting on there since I initially put it there. So very blendable. As you can see from the swatches, very opaque as well, even those really, really deep shades. So I'm going to give it a 9.5. I don't know my reluctance for giving 10s. We've only had one so far. I'm going to give it a 9.5 though, because these, they apply so nicely. They last all day. Again, all the reasons why I would want them to. Did I rank opacity? I don't think I did, but 9.5 I think is the score I want to put on that as well. And then we're just down to the packaging of this palette. So again, sorry, I keep flashing you guys. I'm just sitting here in like a sports bra. I should probably put a t-shirt on, but anyways, again, no wasted space in here. Names are printed out. Big mirror. You can put it however you want. It does show fingerprints, not as badly as like the more metallic kind of covers, but definitely does. Very plain, not much going on there in terms of the front. Same with the back. There is a little bit of that beveling edge going on here again, but it stands on its own. It's very easy to store this. It's not too bulky. It's, you know, it's got a good heft to it, but it's not, I don't think there's anything redundant in the packaging. Like, I don't think there's anything unnecessary. So I'm going to give it a 9. I am now going to tally up all the scores, and we are going to establish our actual order. So I'm coming in at 10th place with a score of 28.5 out of a possible 50. We've got Mary Jane from Melt Cosmetics. And then tied for 9th, I guess, or 8th, I don't know how we'd say it, but 8th and 9th place here, tied with the same score of 36 out of 50. We've got BH Cosmetics Sugar Cone and Colourpop Going Coconuts. Then next up with a score of 40.5, we've got Natasha Denona's Glam Palette, followed closely by the Natasha Denona Glam Face Palette, which scored 41.5. Then we have another tie with a score of 43 points each. We've got ABH Sultry and Artist Couture Supreme Nudes. And then we have the Patrick Ta Major Dimension palette with a score of 44 out of 50. followed by the Makeup by Mario Ethereal Eyes palette, which scored 44.5. And coming in at our top spot, we have the Luce Del Sole palette from Christina Sicalius, which scored 47 out of a possible 50 points. So I'll say there were a couple surprises in here for me. I mean, not Mary Jane. I anticipated that it was going to be in the bottom, and it was. I did not expect this one to be number one, but I'm quite pleased about that, especially considering it is the most expensive of the palettes we've talked about today. I thought that Sultry would rank a little bit higher, and I certainly thought that Glam would rank higher than it did, but that's why I wanted to do it this way. So I know it's been a very, very long video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about this kind of ranking style. I may have more ranking things to do. I don't know, but I really wanted to do this one, and I was intrigued to find out the results, so I hope you were too. But having said that, I am going to wrap the video up here. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch. I know this was a lengthy one, but if you did enjoy it, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I ask that you consider doing so. But otherwise, I will see you in my next video. Until then, just be a decent human being. Bye for now.